welcome to the Deep Dive Book Club podcast. I'm Joel.
I'm Leo.
And thanks for joining us today.
Would you like to tell people where they can reach us?
They can reach us at a multitude of avenues. deepdivebookclub@gmail.com. Send us an email. Patreon/deepdivebookclub. X @deepdivebc. Instagram Deep Dive Book Club. YouTube Deep Dive Book Pod. And I think that's good. No one's going to go to our RSS website.
Probably not. And for anyone just tuning in, this podcast is centered on having long format discussions about books we have read or books that we are in the process of reading. We dive into both fiction and nonfiction books. The only thing better than reading a good book is having a great discussion about it, and we want to include you in the conversation. So today, this is our third
and final
episode of our discussion on Byung-Chul's Burnout Society, a little book that is full of things to talk about. We ended our discussion last week in going on many different diverse trails from Byung-Chul's thoughts on the decline of religiosity and what he sees that effect on society as being.
This is the part where if we had more people inputting a dialogue and discourse, we could have that and engage with that. That would be great. I look forward to that day.
First topic that I wanted to jump into right off the bat is the two kinds of tired that Byung-Chul talks about. Specifically in the essay Society of Tiredness, Han describes two kinds. One that causes someone to feel isolated and inwardly focused, and another kind of tiredness that makes you feel connected to the things and people around you. The isolating tiredness is the kind Han thinks is predominant in our late modern world. The peaceful, connected feeling tiredness he thinks is necessary for contemplativeness and creativity. Han points out it is significant that the day of rest is the holy one in Judaism. So Joel, this begs the question, have you experienced more than one kind of tired, and have you experienced the various kinds of tiredness that he is describing?
There are several things to engage in Han's writings here about the tiredness. I imagine most modern people listening to the podcast have access to the internet and therefore is a part of our internet culture. And have we experienced the tiredness? I think a lot of people experience isolationism and the feeling of being lonely even while surrounded by people or surrounded by electronically connected people. I am not sure that I can't think of specific events where I feel tired that causes me to inwardly focus and feel isolated.
The first thing that comes to mind when thinking about this discussion on multiple kinds of tiredness is the titular word burnout. There is a level of, I guess you can call it tiredness, but there's a level of burnout or exhaustion that, in my experience, kind of dulls the soul, dulls my senses, to where I guess it is isolating in that I don't really feel as capable of engaging with the people and experiences around me, just from a soul-crushing level of exhaustion, whether that be from, working 3 months in a row or, miserably grinding periods of stressful work. But I'm not sure that is a different kind of tiredness. I think that's an exhaustion. Now, the pleasant kind of tiredness, I don't know that I've experienced exactly what Han is describing there either. I do think that one of the best feelings is after a pleasantly challenging day, especially with an appropriate level of physical challenge, that there's not much that feels better than being able to lie down in the bed and fall asleep deeply and contentedly thanks to that level of tired. After a strenuous day of playing at the beach, or after a day that's filled with a lot of cardio or working out, that leads to some pleasant level of tiredness right before bed that makes sleep feel great, but not necessarily contemplative.
The contemplative tiredness I have experienced is typically from hiking, camping, caving, rock climbing, scuba diving, or as you're saying, exhaustion, physical exhaustion, though for me it's usually through excursions, as in I've gone out into nature and have bathed in nature in a way that gives me that contemplative tiredness where I'm sitting in my tent or I'm sitting in my hammock at the end of a long trek and I feel the overwhelming tiredness of connectivity, and almost as though my thoughts themselves become poetry to my exhausted body as I listen to the owls hoot above me and the crickets and chirps of frogs near me, and I feel that connective, contemplative tiredness. But I would say it's a combination of both being in nature or having been in nature with that tiredness. I don't know that I've experienced it in Hans' words if I only say did a super hard cardio day and workout day in a gym and then came home to that. I don't experience that connectivity.
I will say that the most creative that my brain gets is after being on a hike or out in nature for a while. And I think there might be a combination of the calming effects of being outdoors, plus the tiredness, plus the change of environment and pace that combines in all the right levels to have a very contemplative space mentally and emotionally.
I think there's something ancestral in the activation of our brain as we go to a new locality and we engage with the safe and dangerous external stimuli that comes in. So when you're hiking in a new area or you're in a new place, your brain is already heightened due to that desire for self-preservation. Even if it's a positive and enjoyable experience, like when I go to a new rock and I'm rock climbing, I'm extra vigilant and I'm in a flow state of being aware of what's dangerous, where the cliff is, how do I clip it in, and I'm hyper vigilant at that time. But in a truly enjoyable way because I love being out there. But my brain still has that, again, this is my speculation, that ancestral wire of I'm in a new place, so I don't know what is safe and what is not safe.
So you're reaching that optimal level of challenge and danger.
Would be my postulation here, that it helps you reach a flow state. In the same way, a bear walking through a new area eating blueberries is in a flow state.
If I remember correctly from stuff I've read about flow states, you need to have an appropriate level of challenge. You need to be doing something you enjoy. You need to not be interrupted. You also need something that is right on the edge of your skill set, where it's using your skill set as much as it can without pushing you too far over the edge. And that those are some of the main ingredients for a flow state. And there's not much that's as enjoyable or pleasant than being in a true flow state. That's for sure. How that relates to tiredness, I'm not sure.
I was merely adding in that tiredness for me comes from being in those scenarios. If I'm trying to understand Han's meanings here, in the way Han describes, could be a lost in translation issue, or could be I'm not comprehending correctly. But I don't feel a tiredness that he's describing other than this unique mixture and combination.
Right. Yeah, that's the only way I can think of accessing something close to what he's talking about here.
He does point out the day of rest in Judaism, but also in other religions and other cultures, there's this idea of a day of rest or a day of contemplation and reflection, which I think would hearken to his mentality of needing repose in order to grow and be creative and be truer to ourselves. And that part I see as a value to our culture.
Right, and that relates to the discussion we had last episode about Nietzsche's thoughts on the same thing, ability to think and be creative and contemplative. So, moving on from tiredness, let's talk about rewards. One of the thoughts that Han lays out in the Burnout Society essay is a major difference between workers in the modern era compared to the previous. In the past, workers were mostly compelled to work by external forces and also rewarded for work and moral behavior by external forces, the most important one being God. Happiness and reward for moral behavior were seen as being handed out by God, and this allowed the worker to participate in a story larger than himself. By contrast, the late modern worker is mostly compelled to work and achieve by internal forces, and the only real reward that is expected is the pleasure and comfort that the work can allow one to achieve. Hahn thinks that this lack of external reward and lack of participation in a larger story leads to a lot of the mental suffering seen in modern society, namely depression, narcissism, anxiety, loneliness. First thought I have here is how true is this problem, the way he is describing it, that workers are not participating in a larger picture, and therefore that opens them up to vulnerabilities and afflictions of the mind and the soul. I will say I've worked jobs where I did not like what I was doing, and there was a disconnect from what I spent most of my time doing and doing anything and feeling like I'm engaging with meaningfulness.
In no way am I attacking Hahn's work here, but I will say his expression of the rewards then and now and his pulling in of worker connectivity, worker hours, and all of this is so vague and decontextualized that it's difficult to grapple with in a meaningful way, because we have he opens it up and there's nothing to truly engage with here because it's so open. Are we not participating in a larger story? Some context of history, some people were participating in a larger story, such as a Greek city-state, that they all were working towards their own goals. So a farmer in a Greek city-state that also worked as a soldier was participating in a larger narrative. I can see that. But I don't think necessarily that the 1700s, 1800s coal miners of Britain saw themselves as working towards an overall narrative. It was more of a individualistic narrative of I have to feed myself or I have to feed my family, and I'm going to work the necessary amount of hours for that. Nowadays, we work less hours than many generations beforehand, and I think it was 1800s, 1700s, most workers would be working 70 to 100 hours a week, and now we have a more standardized 40-hour work week, although of course we have more of that and less of that in various areas. But is that what Hahn is talking about here? Because maybe he doesn't mean 200 years ago or 100 years ago. Maybe he means 1,000 years ago. And so in that part, it's too open to hit narrowly, and so we have to discuss it broadly. Does that make sense?
I can see how you can see that, and I think that what Hahn's doing here is he's more so continuing the conversation on the decline of religiosity and its effect on culture and society. And he's looking at it from another angle here, which is if someone is doing work that is difficult or not meaningful in and of itself, that someone who has a larger story and narrative to participate in outside of that work, then that's a mental safety net. It's an emotional safety net to protect them from that meaninglessness. They still get meaning and they still get to participate in a larger narrative, even if what they're doing is something boring or not intrinsically valuable. I believe that's what he's doing here, is continuing that discussion on the effects of decline of religiosity in relation to work.
A powerful why so that they can withstand the how.
Correct. I believe that's what he's getting at.
Why am I arduously working the factory or field or mine? It's because I'm participating in some godly work. Why am I going through all this suffering? Because I'm participating in a larger narrative.
Correct. And it doesn't necessarily need to be religion, because that's not specifically what he calls out here, but that's the easiest example. Well, he does call out, rewards handed out by an external force, and the most important and potent one being God himself. So I think that's it. I think it's the absent a larger narrative, people become their own reward centers, and the rewards are limited to such ephemeral and fleeting things as your comfort and material gain, which if you lose the ability to get those material gains or get the comfort you can derive from your work, or even if you're having a hard time at a survival level, those lose their ability to help with meaning making because you're absent your capacity to engage with them. Whereas if you had a larger narrative to fall back on, oh, I'm going through these hardships or these difficult tasks because I am helping this larger narrative, or I'm participating in this larger story. One of the most powerful and ancient ones is, of course, us versus them, good versus evil, which harkens back to our conversation on the denial of death, and that while that is one of the most powerful and ancient myths that we can participate in and hero projects we can engage in, it comes with its own inherent problems of creating an us versus them, creating an unnecessarily adversarial situation.
I can see that, but I think plenty of workers in the past were suffering through that, and it was more of a potential for exploitation. You have to keep working because you're part of the nation. You have to keep working because you're doing this godly work.
Yeah,
we
I
can
agree
still
with
do
you.
self-exploitation.
It's a tool for exploitation in the wrong hands, but that doesn't really have anything to do directly with what he's talking about here. Is the role of larger narratives with work.
I guess in regards to it is a flow of his work, and he's continuing that thread, and I'm still maintaining my distance from that thread by saying we now have made it from a broad potential for exploitation to a individual potential for exploitation, which he discusses here in terms of individuals now being the locus of control for reward, right? Or the locus of control for their own narration, which perhaps in that case, he would be accurate in saying it's more atomized.
And part of the issue that he ascribes here is, of course, that decline of religiosity. He would say that's a major factor. Other things that come to mind is the degree to which globalization is happening and the effects that might have on people way down at the individual levels. The ways our communication technology has evolved over the past century or two, and how that affects how we engage with each other and information in general. The amount and variety of information we have access to, we've discussed that before. So these are all things that could affect people's ability to engage in larger narratives beyond just decline in religiosity.
The issues people grapple with to overcome anxiety, stress, fear, depression, excess positivity, as Han would say, I would say potentially have changed or shifted because of the globalization, internet culture, and all of that. As we see individuals nowadays have this comparison. We have good research studies on social media effects on people's happiness because you're constantly seeing this comparison to others. You're seeing the idealization of different lives that you wouldn't necessarily have had prior to internet culture or this look at me culture. So now, maybe this is in line with Han's discourse here, or maybe it's not. I can see the pressure of the individual to overcome anxiety, stress, fear, depression as now much more of a individual task rather than a more broad or cultural global task. Does that make sense?
That does. I'm thinking of something I read in Carl Jung. I'll see if I can hunt down the quote. But essentially, Jung posits that there's stages of maturity and adaptation that need to happen, especially as we go through the transition from being a younger adult to being a middle-aged person. And one of the only substitutes for that process is going through a truly difficult life or going through truly difficult hardships. And I just thought that was an interesting point to bring up in relation to what people are dealing with in their external and internal reward centers in relation to what Han's talking about here. But I'd have to hunt down the quote.
Right. In general, we have a majority participating in the reward systems of the society. All the way back to ancient society in BCE, you have different cultures developing a different reward system to achieve some outcome. Like being a horse archer is not just something you can produce. It's something that is derived from a culture of little children learning how to be around horses, interact with horses, and things like that. And we see lots of examples in the ancient world of people wanting to have different formations in their army, but you can't just grow them in your backyard. It comes from an entire cultural pointing towards rewarding some outcome. Nowadays, in this modern society, we have the exact same thing. If you participate in our culture, you will get these rewards, be it military accolades, academic accolades, whatever field you're in. There are those external reward systems. But there are also a lot of internal reward systems that have probably changed over the past 50, 60 years as we've continued this globalization.
Right. And I think that's the other part of the picture besides the decline of religiosity here. Now move to narcissism. So Byung-Chul Han, quoting Richard Sennett, says, quote, "As a character disorder, narcissism is the very opposite of strong self-love. Self-absorption does not produce gratification. It produces injury to the self. Erasing the line between self and other means that nothing new, nothing other, ever enters the self. It is devoured and transformed until one thinks one can see oneself in the other, and then it becomes meaningless. The narcissist drowns in the self." End quote. What do you think on Byung-Chul Han's thoughts here on narcissism? It was really Richard Sennett's thoughts on narcissism that Byung-Chul Han brings into the conversation.
Narcissism is a characteristic disorder that we see being prevalent in today's society, but I also think it's been prevalent historically as well.
I think Han would argue that the increased focus on individuality in modern societies, in certain modern societies, leads to more garden variety narcissism taking place. Kind of flattens someone's psychological and emotional terrain that they can engage with.
It's possible. I don't know that we have a dipstick to measure that with, but it's possible.
I've heard the argument made that one of the reasons that going out in nature and facing tough challenges, especially in nature, is calming and beneficial is that it helps put us in proportion to the world around us. Where I think an exercise that I heard described is have someone on a piece of graph paper draw a representation of themselves and put them through an exercise where they're physically challenged in nature or they're up against something tough. Have them repeat the exercise of drawing themselves, and their drawing is smaller than before. It shrinks the focus on the self, and it shrinks the image we have on the self. If the level of energy and attention that we are giving to our self is too much, then we're hyper fixated on that to the detriment of being able to engage with the world around us, the people around us in a meaningful way. It causes a lot of anxiety because that ends up being all there is in your world. I think we run into the same thing in our modern society when people spend too much time focusing on the news on social media and the glut of information available on social media. There's a hyperfixation on that leads to anxiety because you begin seeing that as a disproportionately large slice of reality when there's much more to engage with.
Sure. Someone living in New York City is probably absorbed in cultural lenses rather than potentially larger perspective lenses. Not against New York City living people, just saying that if you're inundated with cultural lenses, then you get inundated with this self-reflecting ideology of I need to look better, or I need to be the big person and go make money, or I need my images on Instagram to get this many likes to validate my existence.
Right. We did have an interesting conversation on the first episode of our discussion here, I believe, about social media and the effects it has when you begin to have a relationship of sorts with creating and maintaining your online image. And that image almost becomes a self-made vampire that saps energy and attention into itself from you that could otherwise be spent in other meaning-making ways and engaging ways.
And I imagine that can lead to that feeling of depression, anxiety, and all of the other deleterious effects that Han talks about.
And it also reminds me of a very modern thing that we've been seeing with the advent of chat AIs where people establish relationships and they just get way too engaged mentally and emotionally with these chat AIs, and they're empty vessels emotionally that they engage with, and oftentimes leads to bad outcomes. We've seen multiple suicides now due to people having an unhealthy relationship with an AI chatbot. We've had people have mental disorders and mental breakdowns from unhealthy relationships established with chat AIs. And it's the same thing. You are doing a very human thing of creating an intercourse, a relationship with something, a social style relationship, because that's the main way we know to engage with things. But this thing that you're engaging with only takes and corrupts if you're pouring energy into it. Whereas if you're pouring the same energy and focus into a fellow human being, there is the chance for reciprocity and having a more balanced
there's the chance for it. But that's very human of us to do. Even prior, right, we would have polytheism and the idea that animism, I think a very human thing. We go out and we talk to the bird, or we talk to the sky, talk to the rock, in a way that we are engaging with intercourse with the world around us and dialogue with the world around us, because
much like Santiago and the Old Man in the Sea.
And we're pouring that meaning making into everything around us. In a way, I see that as very human. In this case, we have digital platforms for you to do that, and we've taken away some of that nature connectivity, in which the digital world doesn't have as much reflection capabilities like you're talking about. A chat AI or online platforms aren't going to have as much reflection for you to gain back the energy that you're pouring into it.
Circling back to narcissism, it's the same type of relationship we're describing here, where you are having a relationship with something. In this instance, it's the relationship with yourself, or the image of yourself internal, as a locus of your world and a center of your world that doesn't feed back the way engagement with other people in the external world would. A different kind of isolation.
Is it more now than before? Maybe. It's just an imbalance of ego, in my opinion.
Yeah. So let's push a little further into the essay, and the next thought that Han develops here is, again, he's in dialogue with Richard Sennett's work. Han says that Richard Sennett thinks that narcissists intentionally avoid achieving goals because achieving a goal creates something objectifiable outside of oneself, which, being independent of the narcissistic self, would threaten to weaken the self. Han disagrees and thinks that the economic and social pressures of modern society encourage ambiguity and inconclusiveness and discourages closure and finality, thus making it difficult for an achievement subject to ever experience a sense of achieving a goal and feeling closure. So let's talk about this. The relationship between feeling closure and finality. Han thinks it's modern social and economic pressures. He disagrees with Sennett's conclusion that narcissists have a hard time making and achieving goals because that would be to feed an image diametrically opposed to the self-image they're nurturing.
I don't necessarily agree with Sennett in that I think plenty of narcissists develop tulpas, or external portions of themselves, in various forms. So I don't think Sennett's correct there, because I see narcissists accomplish whatever thing, big or small, and then feel very proud of this thing because it's a reflection or a representation of themselves. Children especially, I see narcissists almost like exploit their children in a way to say, look at how good I am because my child is good.
I've seen what you're describing. I've also seen in ways what Sennett is describing. I've seen people a little too self-absorbed, or people that we would describe as narcissistic self-sabotage. I've also seen very creative and elaborate mental gymnastics done to come up with reasons and stories as to why they couldn't achieve or pursue X, Y, and Z. It's very interesting to see. But you're right. There's plenty of examples of narcissists achieving something, and it just is another way of defining it in relation to themselves.
Yeah, everything is the definition or reflection of themselves, and they see their reflection too great in the water and end up drowning in themselves.
Yeah, I've seen both.
In terms of the self-sabotage, I too have seen those things in people we would ascribe a narcissistic personality. Two, oftentimes, and maybe you have a different experience, I see these individuals as success is an internal locus of control, but any failure is an external locus of control. They've done nothing wrong to achieve that. This is the reasons why, which is some external reason that they were unable to accomplish the thing.
Right. I think what you're pointing out is that the focus for some people becomes hyperfixated on the avoidance of failure, which leads to its own kind of self-sabotage.
Exactly.
Of not pursuing something because of the potential for failure.
Exactly. And that is them protecting their ego, is what I see. Rather than they set out on a journey and then self-sabotage, I see the self-sabotage even before they start their journey.
So then let's look at what Han's talking about. He's disagreeing with Sennett and saying that the poor relationship people have with closure and finality now is heavily influenced by the encouraged ambiguity and inconclusiveness of today's social and economic pressures. One thing that this makes me think of is office work. Office work, you can work very hard for 80 hours a week, and if you're not producing something tangible, it's very difficult to have a level of conclusiveness for your work compared to someone who is maybe crafting jewelry or crafting a specific piece of work, or someone who's making something tangible. Different psychological relationship, and there's a different level of finality and conclusiveness there. That's the example I can think of in support of what Han's describing here.
If I were to give it a charitable reading, to which I would agree to, is Han might be describing the consumerism culture we have of no finality. Once you achieve this level of success, there's still the next level. Once you get this level of car, there's a better car for you to go get. This house, you should get a better house. And there's almost, if I were to, again, try to flow Han's argument into what I agree with, is I do see a lot of that. I do see, especially American culture, Western culture, of you shouldn't be satisfied with what you have. You shouldn't be satisfied with just your familial relationships. You can achieve more. You can work harder. You can make more money. So why don't you? There is no final product. You have to continue to produce.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think that does cause a lot of anxiety in our society now, because we don't have this idea of, hey, you have enough, why don't you just rest and have repose?
Right, enough is enough. Yeah, where everything, the world where everything is possible means that everything becomes a should, to paraphrase his main through line here.
Right. And without getting deep into the weeds of socioeconomics, we expect, if you work a traditional job, you expect a raise every year. You expect more. And let's not get into the argument of inflation and all these things, but we have this constant cycle of continued production and continued consumption. And I agree with that. That does mean that there is no closure. And we do have this positive, productive society of, great, you produced a book. Well, what's the next book? Great, you did this project. What's the next project? Hey, you just finished this school degree, high school, associates, bachelor's, whatever. Well, what's the next degree you're going to get?
There is a way that we engage with everything through the mechanism of consumption. So it causes problems a lot of times. A good example is if someone watches a show and that show makes one season. You consume the show, but the underlying narrative you have is, when's the next season coming out? I want more. Same thing with a book series. I've read this book. I want to read the next one. And you focus a lot more on what you are consuming next, acquiring things in an embodied way, acquiring the next thing to consume mentally or emotionally or in an entertainment style, rather than being satiated on the thing itself or chewing more contemplatively on the thing itself.
I would say I agree with that. And in this point, I do agree with Han in that we have a culture and society of not feeling closure, not feeling closure. So you constantly have to continue. Otherwise, you're empty.
Okay, let's take a quick break and then let's get into some more Nietzsche.
to get into some things Han has to say with Nietzsche's work as well.
Han quotes Nietzsche to highlight his idea that the modern achievement subject is controlled and fueled by self-exploitation. Here he gives a quote from Nietzsche's work, Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Quote, all of you who are in love with hectic work and whatever is fast, new, strange, you find it hard to bear yourselves. Your diligence is escape and the will to forget yourself. If you believed more in life, you would hurl yourself less into the moment, but you do not have enough content in yourselves for waiting, not even for laziness, end quote. So for me, this seems to be an argument that people use work as a distraction, which I've done that before. I've used work as a just distraction from deeper anxieties and things to focus on and other things that I couldn't readily solve. I could feel like I'm solving and making progress by just working harder as opposed to solving deeper, more underlying issues going on that were a little bit more nebulous or difficult to engage with.
Nietzsche's right in regards to we are sometimes overly worked or busy ourselves with distractions. We're really good at finding distractions, especially in our modern society, because of how easily available it is. Like drugs strewn out on the living room floor, we crawl to them and use them as crutches to continue our daily life, to avoid the anxieties that lie deeper within us that could say are the denial of death. However, in some regards, we are in many ways driven to work because of the need to survive and reproduce. And oftentimes, I think we can't really get to the deeper underlying issues without working through them in some more superficial manner. How do you correct a deep trauma or a lifelong habit or response that you have to situations without using some more superficial activities?
A very interesting thing that I learned about is the positive mental effects of walking. If you take a walk while thinking about or discussing a problem you have, it makes the problem solving easier because you are embodying going from point A to point B, which will help you mentally go from point A to point B. Problem to solution. Super interesting how that works. Very, very, very interesting neuroscience there.
So in regards to Nietzsche, I think he's correct. Like you're saying, there are superficial things we can do, such as walking, or I've had friends where just going fishing helps them work through whatever issue, or going and working out, or doing a physical activity that helps reflect the internal.
Well, there is embodiment there, but I think what Nietzsche is describing here, or at least the way Han is employing this quote, is more so that using hectic work and throwing yourself into something not as a therapeutic or beneficial thing, but as a crutch or distraction.
Yes, I believe that is what Nietzsche means here. I only mean to say it's not a all-in-one. It's not a fully encompassing quote.
Yeah, but he's specifically talking about using work as a distraction. He's not talking about the therapeutic effects of work.
Right. We're saying the same thing.
Other thing I wanted to talk about in relation to this was the glorification of what's known as hustle culture. Joel, how do you feel about hustle culture? Rise and grind.
There are times when we need to grind and times where we need to rest. I think it's okay to employ this tool in certain scenarios, but it's an overused and overabused tool in our current society.
Very much an example of internal driven forces.
For the premise of Han's book, the rise and grind culture or the grind culture is very much a really good argument for that internally driven mechanism for achievement society, as you're pointing out.
And I think this is, for me, just a version. This can easily be a version of that type of coping mechanism for deeper symptoms of not being able to engage with meaningful rest or larger narratives. It's easy to fall into something like glorifying hustle culture or glorifying working yourself to the bone. I've done this myself in my younger days, and I've seen other people do it.
It's a tool, I think, that can be used both for good and bad. Long term, definitely bad. I don't think there's any good long-term application of this. Being obsessed with something, though, I would say is a little bit different in the way we talked about Musashi's obsession with sword work, or different artists' obsession with their art can produce beautiful things. And in some ways people would see it as a grind culture, and Han would say, well, they're not. They're this achievement subject, and they're bound to themselves to pour out into this one thing. But I think if you have an obsession, that there's positive ways to employ this rise and grind culture. But for the most part, I would say if we were to do a Gaussian distribution, the majority of the use of grind or grind culture is in a deleterious way.
It's interesting, reading back over the Nietzsche quote, that he's saying that not even taking time for laziness is a bad thing. So it's just an interesting thought to contemplate. What do you think about positive laziness?
I thought Nietzsche meant that we're just so unhappy with ourselves that we won't even do nothing for the sake of laziness because of how discontented we are and untrustworthy we are, or untrusting we are for life itself.
A lack of trust of life itself. That's a good way to describe what he's getting at here.
Or at least that's what I get when he says, quote, if you believed more in life.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Believing more in life. That would be maybe to put it more in the lens of what Han's talking about here. To believe more in life would be to feel more a part of capital L life as a larger narrative than yourself, a larger picture than yourself.
Could potentially continue the argument for the loss of religiosity in our modern culture, because you now no longer have that narrative to ascribe your life and death to. So if you only have a limited amount of time, i.e. you only live once, then you have this discontentment with life that you need to work harder or achieve more before you die. You are forced to do that. You don't have time for laziness because of the lack of time.
In some cynical ways, having people discontent, to use Nietzsche's word, and having people not connected to a picture larger than themselves would create a kind of emptiness that could be exploited for driving people to pursue what you want them to pursue or work how you want them to work. Because if you are completely satisfied with your relationship with the world and the universe and the reality at large, it would be kind of difficult to convince someone to do something that's not really in their best interest.
As a thought experiment, I wonder if you go to some of the people in really integrated cultures where family is everything and they're very content on their farm or in the mountain with their family, even though they don't have a lot of economic value. I wonder what their interest would be if you said, hey, I'll take you to New York City and you can start working in New York City, away from your family, away from this mountain, away from all that, and how much contentment they would have.
Right. Not very attractive, based off of that context. And it's also, makes me think of the world wars. The dangerous ideas of the early 1900s only had fertile ground to lodge into people's hearts and minds because of discontent and lack of larger narratives and the socioeconomic situations that were oppressing them.
Discontentment and idle hands make for a dangerous population.
Okay, the last thing I wanted to talk about with the text itself, and then we'll jump into our usual wrap-ups of discussions of books. So Byung-Chul Han ends his book with the line, quote, "They are too alive to die and too dead to live," end quote, referring to a worker in our late modern society because he contends that they are empty, lonely, but still full of themselves and clinging to life more than ever. And I can already hear your reaction to this quote. They are too alive to die and too dead to live.
I think it's meant to be a catchy reversal one-liner that Han has here. In regards to the modern worker, we are, in some ways, very empty and we try to fill ourselves with something. But I think we're sometimes caught up in our work so heavily that there is no life to be had. The immediate thought that comes to me is the 16 Tons song that came out of the American coal mining culture, in which the little phrase is, you load 16 tons, what do you get? Another day older and deeper in debt. St. Peter don't call me, 'cause I can't go. I owe my soul to the company store. Kind of embodies what I think of with modern workers being stuck and oppressed by an achievement society around them, where we constantly have to work just to stay in debt to the system that we're stuck in.
Too alive to die, it makes me picture someone on a raft, and the only thing that they have is their image of themselves. They can't get away from it. They're stuck with that. I think that's the culmination of his thoughts on narcissism and our relationship to our own ego. Is that we have an empty landscape around us, but the thing that we are given to cling to is a thing that harms us, is a thing that having a hyperfixated relationship with does us harm and continues that emptiness.
As a counter argument, I am questioning and wondering what we have in life that helps navigate if we were to take Denial of Death, Ernest Becker's work, and apply it here. Every human being has to die. Every human being is going to die. And how do you deal with that crushing anxiety that you can have? In many different answers, there's a negative to that. There's no answer I can think of where there's only positive.
What do you mean there's a negative to it? There's not an answer that's only positive.
The answer to dealing with the existential dread that people can have if you have religious context, there is plenty of ways to exploit that, and there's negative drawbacks to where people are now bound to a group that can do good or bad, evil or good, however you want to put it. If you draw it to a non-religious thing, such as the Soviet Union, where you're working for the state, again, there could be positives, but there's still drawbacks and exploitation that can happen. If we take our modern society, narcissistic man, you are full of yourself, and so getting to this quote where you're too alive to die, there's so much of you that you are going to have to come up with some narrative to deal with the crushing anxiety of death.
For me, the solution is to find a narrative that is to associate with and participate in, but also a narrative that I need a narrative for me that works in the short term, but is also suitable to the long term. So spending time with loved ones and family, cherishing those relationships, and doing what I can to show up the best I can for those loved ones, and conducting myself in such a way that they are taken care of into the future, which is a narrative that is larger than me. It's of the appropriate scale for my spiritual and mental needs today for me, but also works long term for me. It's something that it's a narrative that I can safely participate in and be removed from the story, and the story still goes on. So for me, that lessens the sting of, me as a character in the story, eventually finding my last chapter in that story, but the story keeps going.
Great. Go give that to society. It's great. It's beautiful. I love it. In grappling with Han's discourse here, I don't see society answering that question, but the individual can. There's so many individuals, I'm sure of, both large and small, that have answered that question and have been at peace with it. I'm sure
there are societal answers. You were just pointing out that there's downsides to the societal answers that have traditionally been available.
Right. There's no societal answer that doesn't have any downsides. And I think, or if I'm...
From an external view, I agree with you, but that's if you're looking at them from an external view. Someone who's inside the narrative and who's engaged with it would disagree.
Sure, why not? Then all of Han's work would be meaningless, because then he's just looking at external aspects.
Both. I think he is making a point here and being a little hyperbolic, but I take his point. I understand his point. At the same time, the level of negativity and pessimism just doesn't lodge home for me, because I see antidotes to the problem he is saying, but that doesn't make me not see the problem that he's pointing out. So I agree the problem is there. I also see that there's antidotes to the problem.
Okay, we have finished the book. What a journey that has been. Let's go ahead and kind of wrap this up here, and we'll get to our closing, and we'll start with our opinions, and we'll probably disseminate our opinions further as we get into the reviews. My opinion on the book, overall, it's a short book. It's a good book. It has many good themes. Sometimes it's a little pedantic. Sometimes it's unnecessarily arduous and difficult rhetoric or difficult ways that he wrote it. But to be charitable, it's a difficult subject matter. Han is trying to push the discourse in a new realm, and there's a translation issue there. So in many ways, it is a good book. I do think maybe if I read it in German, I could have a better understanding of its relative rhetoric. But alas, here we are. Many good topics, though, for discussion. What do you think, Leo?
So my overall opinion is that, well, first let me start by saying that the ebook version I read was only 70 pages. And the return on time and calories invested was, for me, well worth it. With that relatively small time investment, I got a lot out of it. I did have to chew on some of the writing and wording. The brevity and conciseness of the work doesn't fit exactly into what we think of as a philosophy book, but for me, that's perfectly okay. The concepts that I did take with me from this book are travel-sized, which I appreciate. The two that I probably think about the most are Han's idea of resistance and his idea of an achievement subject, both of which I can just keep thinking about and using as lenses to apply to various situations and topics that come up. So very glad I read it. It is frustrating sometimes, but it's a great little book.
Great. And with that, there's a couple of quotes we wanted to give from the book that I think stand out as kind of key markers for what I pulled out of the book, maybe what Leo pulled out of the book. So we'll just get into them. Quote, "The high point of bodily relaxation, deep boredom is the peak of mental relaxation. A purely hectic rush produces nothing new. It reproduces and accelerates what is already available." End quote.
Quote, "Depression, which often accumulates in burnout, follows from overexcited, overdriven, excessive self-reference that has assumed destructive traits. The exhausted, depressive achievement subject grinds itself down, so to speak. It is tired, exhausted by itself, and at war with itself, entirely incapable of stepping outward, of standing outside itself, of relying on the other, on the world. It locks its jaws on itself. Paradoxically, this leads the self to hollow and empty out. It wears itself out in a rat race it runs against itself." End quote.
I think that one's a great example of what Han is giving us to chew on and the rhetoric that he uses. It's a good one. Okay, last one for today. Quote, "Today, everyone is an auto-exploiting laborer in his or her own enterprise. People are now master and slave in one. Even class struggle has transformed into an inner struggle against oneself." End quote.
Great highlight that brings up his main through line through all of this. So, as has become our tradition with ending these episodes, you went and found us some critiques and poor reviews.
I really enjoy this part of our podcast because I like reading the good and bad reviews, and I try to encompass the majority of the views that I see in three little subsections. I would do it in 2 or 1 if I found that in one of the future books that we have. So, Leo, the first main section of 1-star, 0-star reviews I read is that it's a milquetoast set of essays with academic words to say nothing of deep interest. And the example I'll give you is from something someone on Goodreads wrote. Quote, "The author knows a lot of big words and how to arrange them in short and impenetrable, abstruse sentences. Han contributes nothing novel to the discourse on modernity except predictions already proven wrong and unfounded and unwarranted assumptions. The rest of the work is a regurgitation of common and overly simplistic critiques of capitalism and modernism." End quote.
Joel, how do you feel about that critique? I think I know what you're going to say, but I want to hear you say it.
I think there's some merits to this critique in that I believe Han does unnecessarily make simplistic concepts.
So I figured you would say essentially that. So with this reviewer here, let's start with The author knows a lot of big words and how to arrange them into short and impenetrably abstruse sentences. I have no argument with that. I also think that's just the nature of the landscape when dealing with some of these types of works. However, the second point that this reviewer makes here, that Han contributes nothing novel to the discourse on modernity except blah, 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 blah. I think that's one interpretation of it. I also think it's a way of not truly engaging with the points that he makes. I think Han makes points that, again, due to the brevity and the bullet-like fashion with which he drops a point and doesn't fully flesh out and engage with it, is infuriating, and people can get hung up on that rather than engaging with the concept and the idea for what it is within the confines of where it's sitting, rather than, hey, this little Lego piece doesn't fit into the rest of the Lego piece construction, therefore let's focus on the fact that it doesn't fit, rather than engaging with the arguments themselves. I think both are useful, but I think it could be distracting to not engage with the ideas itself. You need both. You need to see that this cute little Lego piece doesn't fit anywhere in the structure that's already there, but also at the same time engage with it by itself and look at it by itself within the confines of its own limitations. That's how I feel about that negative review.
Great. Moving on to the next section of bad reviews I read. I read through a lot of them, and I would say the second highest number of them was basically, I just fundamentally disagree with the author's proposition. Quote, "This book was utter nonsense. Burnout is not the result of excess positivity, nor have we transitioned to a society without external domination. Has the author ever worked in their life?" End quote. One more. Quote, "The author's concept of depression is utterly unscientific and completely ignores the well-established medical consensus that mental illness is chemical and not merely personality-related. Through the whole work, Han borrows from the bastardized medical and psychological theories, many of which have been completely debunked, to prove his points. This contributes no value." End quote.
Both of these reviews take nuance and completely eliminate it. There's nuance to be had, but it's very hard to disagree with what they're saying here. He does completely gloss over the chemical nature of depression. There's a lot of nuance left wanting, and I think that's what they see here.
A detriment to the work, I believe, is present in Han's writings is that he uses common modern terms, but without properly defining his meaning before he goes into it, which adds to the brevity of his work, but increases the ambiguity and inability to grapple with the work.
Structurally, it also invites the exact problem with engagement that you have and previous reviews have.
Right. And I understand perhaps it takes away from the realm of writing to define your terms and makes it more concrete. And in one regard, and I'll have both sides here, but one regard is that makes you more liable for what you mean because you now can't hide behind a facade of ambiguity. But on the other hand, on the creative side, it does allow for more people to engage with their meaning of the world and their view of the world with what you have said. And I can understand it being a difficult spectrum as to where you want to put that.
Yeah, because it sits in an odd place. Okay, are you a philosophy book? Therefore, you need to be doing things that allows you to fully plug into and engage with the discourse that is philosophy. Or are you just a poetic series of bullet point thoughts? Which are you? And I think that's something that people struggle with.
Right, and I think he blends...
Understandably.
I think he blends in between the two, making it difficult to take everything he says on the value that it is. In the way we have Lord of the Rings, which is a fictional work that you can engage with because you know the rules, or you have a instruction manual for how to set up a printer, which is written in an exact way that you can engage with. And I think his work kind of weaves on that spectrum. Oh, another fun one, just because I thought of it, is if I were to say, Leo, the backside attack I don't think is going to work on this compound, but I give you no other context, you're just going to not understand what backside attack means. That could mean anything. In chemistry, it is a SN2 reaction, or basically a way that a chemical compound reaction can happen. Backside attack just means that it comes on the other side where there's space to connect to the next atom. Or another great one, just because I'm having fun here, is evolve. We use the word evolve in a common parlance, but that doesn't necessarily mean the scientific use of that word. And so they can be misconstrued. And sometimes you just have to define your terms when you're producing work.
Right. And this is something that cropped up in our discussion where we spent time talking about, okay, what does he mean, or what could he mean by using terms such as depression, burnout, narcissism? Right.
Yeah. In that case, he could have had a whole essay or a glossary on those terms. I think that would have added to his work. But still great work. I don't want to disparage his work too much. Last, large collection of critiques I found, and you could kind of see them in the first and second one too, is the author brings nothing new to the table. Quote, the author seems to have collected a series of passages from multiple sources and tried to shoehorn their ideas into a nonsensical theory of positivity versus negativity. That bears no semblance to society, end quote.
Part of that I'll disagree with, in that he doesn't necessarily agree with the quotes he uses. He often brings in a quote. More often, if I'm remembering correctly, he brings in a quote to disagree with it rather than agree with it. If you look at the quote in the very first essay, he disagrees with the virality argument of Baudrillard, I believe. Nietzsche, though, he does agree with the 2 or 3 Nietzsche quotes that are in the book.
Great. Okay, that's probably encompassing 90% of all the bad reviews that I read. Now, moving on to the good reviews, which might even have some critiques of the bad reviews themselves in them. So let's get to it. Vast majority of the positive reviews or 5-star reviews I read was basically, I agree with the idea of cultural burnout.
You want me to attempt to read verbatim what is written in this good review?
I think with the amount of capitalization this person used, they loved the book. So go ahead.
Okay, I'm just going to read verbatim what's on the page here. There are all caps. This person had a good time writing this. Quote, when is enough enough? What happens if the answer is never? Byung-Chul Han posits that our contemporary consumer capitalist culture of me branding creates an excess of positivity and a collapse of negativity. By positivity, he means just too fucking much. Abundance, information, calories, work, ego. And by negativity means not enough. Scarcity, silence, hunger, solitude, sleep, vulnerability. Han posits that we are under existential threat like never before. Only today's threat is not coming from out there. It's coming from within. End quote. We should have just read this and skipped having 3 episodes on this. This is it succinctly. This is his point.
Yeah, that was his point, and I think the reviewer does a great job, perhaps unintentionally, of summarizing some of the verbiage that Han means here, that Han could have benefited from having in his book.
I mean, this is the book. Just read this review, and you don't have to read the book.
Yeah, I mean, even he puts it in almost a poetic way. Only today's threats is not coming from out there; it's coming from within. I mean, that's like a fourth of Han's book right there.
Yeah, there you go. Put in more simpler language.
Great. So that also is a good segue into the next one, which is the second largest number of good reviews I read. Is basically it's good and the concise nature is key.
Okay, so you may stab this one.
Yeah, go for it.
All right. Quote, quite frankly, I agree with many of Byung-Chul's observations. We do live in a society of the performance, one that kills the soul. It clouds over our view of the world, of what we need and of what we must abandon. We don't live with enough interruption. Though I don't find the distractions necessarily bad, have you seen how many books I read when I should be studying instead? We should direct humanity into paths that embrace a more positive form of tiredness and rewards reflection and awareness. We can do better. A great book that never drags or loses focus. We'll definitely read more by the author in the future. End quote.
There you go.
Hey, someone liked it.
So people that liked the book often liked the brevity. And I don't have a third subset because most of the positive reviews could have fit into one of those two camps.
Yeah. The brevity is a selling point to some people, and it's a tripping hazard for others.
And with that kind of wraps up the book. Great summaries by reviewers, good critiques, I think, this time by some of the bad reviews.
These also from Goodreads?
Also from Goodreads. That's where I get it, because that's where I can find the most amount of reviews and just read through them and everything. I will say some bad reviews we read, though, man, it is ludicrously missing the point of anything that the author wrote.
Right. Yeah. So that's our discussion.
That's it. I'm so happy.
Completed our discussion on Burnout Society.
So happy to walk away from Burnout Society. We're so done with this. I'm done with this. 3 episodes.
Come on, we could have done a 4th.
No, absolutely not. I could emotionally not afford a 4th episode.
Well, to each their own, I suppose. So we will be back next episode with another great book to discuss, or not so great book to discuss, or multiple books to discuss. We'll see. In the meantime, please reach out to us at deepdivebookclub@gmail.com. Go find us on Patreon, Instagram, X, YouTube, wherever you get your pods. And until then, we will see you next time.
Thanks for joining in, and we'll see you next episode.